So welcome, ladies. Thanks for being here on this beautiful day. Okay. So just to give everyone a little bit of context, obviously we've seen how important health protecting and safeguarding health data is. Healthcare is seen as one of the most vulnerable and most targeted cybersecurity targets because of all the sensitive information and identifiable data. We've seen the headlines about ransomware, paralyzing hospital systems, and putting people's most sensitive information at risk. So I want to kick off the panel by asking all of you about the biggest cybersecurity challenges you're struggling with right now. So we'll start with Sonja.
Good afternoon. Well, actually, still morning.
Still morning.
I would probably say one of our biggest cybersecurity challenges will probably be medical devices and cybersecurity. Medical devices, just like any other computer system, is vulnerable to breaches as well as potential impacts to safety and effectiveness of that particular device. As well as we use more wireless technology and the software associated with those medical devices, that too also increases cybersecurity and those risks. But at the same time, it's those same features that improve healthcare as well as improving the healthcare that the providers can actually provide. So yes, it becomes very challenging when we're addressing those cybersecurity threats, mainly because we cannot eliminate those threats. So what do? It's working with those manufacturers for those medical devices as well as with those healthcare facilities, ensuring that they put in place those safeguards. With the manufacturing companies at the early phase, the design phase, ensuring that they are looking at and identifying those cybersecurity risks, as well as with those healthcare facilities, ensuring that they're looking at their network security and protecting their hospital systems as well.
Shannon?
Yeah, first of all, I want to say thank you for putting together an all-women panel on cybersecurity. I'm sure all of us recognize how unbelievably rare that is and how important it is, so thank you for doing that.
And we didn't market it that way, so this is not a women in technology panel marketing. It just happens that 3 experts are women.
It's a big deal, so thank you guys. So I think from the perspective of some of the projects that my team is working on, a lot of which involve trying to put more data out for beneficiaries to use, for clinicians to use as they're making decisions about beneficiary care. The space that we're really looking at is older populations and their engagement with data and ensuring that they have access to the knowledge that they need to understand when they're sharing their data, what implications that might have. Which is a huge deal, right? I think that there's been a lot in the media lately around what people are doing with our data, and a lot of concern has come up. And I think that it raised a lot of ideas that we as technologists may have recognized around what people were potentially doing with our data, but that populations who are not familiar with the potential uses for data were not totally aware of. And so we've really been working on having conversations with beneficiaries to make sure that when they're using, we just built a Medicare claims API for use in third-party applications, for making sure that they understand what that means when they're sharing their data, when they're agreeing to have a third-party application use that. And I think we're also, again, looking at the health ecosystem at large, and as a payer, what implications we potentially can have on security, on things like devices if we pay for them, different systems that are available in hospitals, et cetera. So really focusing on kind of those threats that exist.
And the question can be tweaked a little bit for you, Jean, since you are in academia. So what are some of the cybersecurity challenges out there? And you actually launched a cybersecurity accelerator, so you know this space very well.
Sure, yeah. So when people think of security, they usually think of encryption. Everyone says blockchain is going to fix everything. And while this is promising, it's not the whole story. And so I actually work on a few things that are not blockchain, which I'll talk about. So the first thing I work on is how do we programmatically enforce in the software policies about who can see what data. So encryption talks about how to protect the data, but there's still the question of who to protect the data from. And so right now we're actually working with a hospital network to help them make compliant search over records. So if you have a search like give me all patients with blue eyes and a positive HIV diagnosis, that there's not really a great way to enforce that right now. So in these systems, what happens is there's an audit-based, after-the-fact way of enforcing these policies. Everyone gets to log into the system. The records get decrypted for everyone. It's really honor code. And so having a search engine based on that is not really a great solution. So there's a big question of how do we make sure that the right people get access to sensitive data is a really big problem that not that many people are talking about. The other one is when we're doing machine learning. How do we make sure that the machine learning algorithms aren't revealing too much data? Or even if we're revealing just basic aggregate statistics, like what's the average age of an HIV diagnosis or the average lifespan or something like this. So you might have heard that in small towns, when people go to clinics and that data gets released, there's very little privacy. And so a lot of work has been done on how do we have mathematical foundations for making sure that this kind of information leak doesn't happen as much. And so my work is also about making these kinds of analyses more accessible.
Thank you. So Sonja, you mentioned the kind of medical Internet of Things. And how do you see the cybersecurity threats or the threat landscape change or evolve over the next few years? And how do you think you, in your role, will kind of have to adapt to that? What do you see as the biggest change going forward?
Oh, wow. I think maybe one of the biggest changes moving forward is probably culture in terms of how we think about cybersecurity. Not necessarily just in health IT, but in any type of scenario. Culture, and we always focus on the what and not necessarily the why in terms of how we solve those problems. So adapting a cybersecurity culture moving forward, I think, does two things for any type of practice. It, number one, takes those security practices and intertwines it with those business practices, and overall it improves that security posture, as well as, two, it shows the need from leadership down that everyone needs to be a part of cybersecurity and that everybody needs to own a piece of it for it to move forward.
And Shannon, when you and I talked previously, you said security is often an afterthought, or that's the traditional approach. And you said, we don't want innovation to be stalled because security is an issue. So how do you keep innovating?
Yeah, there's so many pieces to this. So in government specifically, we are burdened by checklists, compliance checklists, that, by the way, don't equal security. So anybody here who believes that, please know you are wrong. It's a huge problem because we've moved to this world where, like you were just saying, we believe that the audit is the thing that solves our problems. And it doesn't. And if we're trying to be innovative and I'm trying to build a product to meet the compliance checklist that I have to do at the end, I'm not really thinking about security in the right way. I think when it comes to innovation, making sure that we're baking in considerations around security from the beginning is unbelievably important. I also think that it's important, as far as regulation and legislation is concerned, to be fairly forward-leaning in our considerations of security, right? We don't. One of the things that keeps me up lately is this idea that post some of the issues that have arisen, we're going to end up with some legislation that really limits our ability to use data and to do the right things. And part of that is about consistently having innovators working in government, working with the legislators to help them understand the various ways that we can make sure to be including security and ensuring that the innovators themselves are also aware of the potential implications around security from the very beginning.
And to follow up on that, you've mentioned that you work with constituents that aren't always tech savvy. It's about raising awareness, so that security aspect definitely has that human aspect. So security is not just about technology, but the awareness. And can you talk a little bit about that, how you are encouraging kind of that culture of security and innovation?
Yeah, so one of the decisions that we made at CMS when we released our Medicare Claims API was to do some really heavy manual vetting of all the applications that integrate with our API. We believe that it is, in a lot of ways, our duty to make sure that we're protecting a population who may not be as technically savvy. That doesn't mean that that's the right decision for every population, but for ours it was. And there's that piece of it. There's also in beneficiary education campaigns, making sure that, again, they understand, what does phishing look like? What do all these various attacks look like? And we as an agency have to be poised to evolve because those attacks change, those technologies change. And if I'm still talking about something that happened in 2015, there's no way that a beneficiary is not going to get owned, right? So we have to make sure to consistently be doing that. And I think that's an important piece in government, and being very, to use the buzzword, agile. Like, I need to be able to move on a dime to make sure that whatever the newest thing that's coming up is, I can protect the beneficiaries or the populations that we serve.
And Jean, you and I talked a little bit about AI, which is used more when it comes to cybersecurity now, automation, machine learning. And you said people are afraid of the AI Armageddon, but what's really scary is when you put your trust into dumb machines. So how do you reconcile that with this expansive ecosystem of medical devices and people wanting to use those more?
Sure, yeah. Well, I think that people often think that software is some magical thing and AI is some even more magical thing that will just solve all of our problems. And I go to these conferences and people are like, yeah, you know, machine learning will just solve precision medicine. No one will ever go untreated again. And it's like, well, you know, these are algorithms developed by people with data developed by people. And, you know, we shouldn't maybe trust them so much. So, yeah, I mean, so in the panel earlier, it was brought up that the AI algorithms are really only as good as the data they were trained on. So there's been some really scandalous results lately, like, you know, there's some algorithm that couldn't do face detection on black people's faces because they just forgot to train on non-white faces. And there's all sorts of stories like that coming out about data being only, the algorithms being only as good as the data. And there's a lot of ways we can make more sense of the algorithm. So there's been work on algorithmic transparency. So if you have an algorithm doing something, you should always make it explain why it made the decisions it made. There's also work on fairness. So how do we remove the bias from the data and the people from an algorithm? And then there's also just making sure that the people making the policies actually understand the limitations of technology, well, both the limitations and the capabilities. Because there are things that technology can do. So my work is all about how do we programmatically enforce certain kinds of privacy policies that, you know, if you could do that for something like Facebook and third-party apps, you don't have to restrict data use as much. But there's also just lots of ways that technology is limited. So I think having this tighter interaction between the people making the legislation and people who understand technology is very important these days.
And talking about software, a few years ago, you created something called Jeeves, a programming language with privacy baked in. And you mentioned to me in our prior discussions that you encourage looking at software like infrastructure. Can you elaborate on that?
Sure, yeah. So a philosophy that I started really believing in when I was a PhD student is that we have other kinds of physical infrastructure that we believe can be inspected and that we believe shouldn't have to fall down. So like a building or a bridge, no one looks at that and says, I don't know, maybe it'll fall down. It's just magic. We just don't understand it. You know, you walk into the building, maybe today you'll just die. And I think most people expect, you know, when you go into a structure that there's like soundness with the structure and all that. But with software, people are just like, we just don't know. We don't know what's going to happen. You can click something and your computer will just explode. And it's like, no. So my area of research, so programming languages and formal methods, it's all about understanding software and actually mathematically proving properties of software. And people have shown that you can do this for operating systems. There's in fact a whole company, Galois, doing this for voting machines. And Airbus has done it for mission critical software. But the problem is, I think, first of all, there's just not this widespread recognition that we don't have to just treat software as something that we know nothing about. And then there's also this lack of viewing software as mission critical. But, so we've seen with the ransomware attack with WannaCry, hospital software is mission critical, but no one is looking at it and saying, please update your machine so you're not running operating systems from the 1990s. No one is looking at it this way. But, our hospital software is critical infrastructure. Our phones are critical infrastructure, because if some nation state can get at the personal information, the cameras of the entire population, then yeah, we should be putting more effort and putting more pressure on the government to make sure the software is not vulnerable in very obvious ways.
And Sonja, you are the chief engineer in your agency, so talk a little bit about how you see how you approach electronic medical records and having a system in place that meets all the requirements.
Well, again, being the chief engineer at Program Executive Office for Defense Healthcare Management System, I actually have several chief engineers that are actually working within the other program managed officers, so they make sure all the requirements are met, number one.
You're part of the team, though.
Absolutely.
It's a team effort.
Absolutely. But again, it's coming back to the basic principles of working with a system of systems, because a lot of what we do, what they do, deals with the whole ecosystem of other systems or health IT systems that we control only a small portion of it, but being able to manage and touch each and everything and make sure everything works succinctly is it's hard. It's difficult. So it's looking at it from a holistic approach, looking at it from having an end-to-end assessment, ensuring that this part talks to the next part, but then when you're looking at root cause analysis in terms of how things are broken down, there's second, third order effects. So it's really managing all of those parts and bringing it all together to ensure that we have a holistic system.
Shannon, do you want to talk about your approach to a holistic system?
Yeah, I can talk a little bit. I think that the one thing that we've learned in our work at CMS, which anybody who is a health IT contractor knows, we have 1 million systems, and a lot of them are old, 60 plus years old, COBOL based. And doing any type of work at CMS usually involves some level of integration within all of those systems. One of the approaches that digital service as a whole has really leaned into is using bug bounties and red teams to really help us address potential security issues. Again, trying to change culture around the checklist is not the end all be all, that we really need to understand using actual people where their potential vulnerabilities in the whole system are. And so I think it's been really enlightening for all of the digital service teams across government to take that approach. I think we've used it on a number of the systems that we've launched, and it's really helped to drive a different way of thinking at CMS. So when we talk about culture change, sometimes just this simple, well, I checked all the boxes, so there's no way you're going to find anything. But wait, a red team's in there, and they just found some serious critical vulnerabilities, is really helpful. And so that, we do a lot of really scrappy approaches to making things happen, and I think that's a lot of what you have to do. We can't plan for everything, and so a concept like bug bounties or red teams seems to be really helpful for us in our, across CMS approach to things.
You also mentioned in our prior talks that there's a misconception that you can't really innovate, but there is a lot of room for innovation.
Yeah.
How?
The how is a little harder. In government, it's really hard, right? There's a lot of pushback when you want to do something new, and a lot of that is fear-driven, and I will blame Congress for a lot of that, right? It is because we are tasked to deliver on specific initiatives, and if they need to change, it's difficult to recommunicate that back up. But us really pushing for innovation, I think, is about it's really been about elevating voices and giving room to the people at the agencies who have identified problems over the years. So somebody who has been doing the same job for 15 years and says, I keep hearing about this new technology, I want to use it, but their manager says, sorry, we don't do that here. And taking that person and really elevating their voice and giving them the opportunity to try something new. So when it comes to innovation in government, one of our biggest things is just asking people to be more malleable in their approaches and be willing to listen to the people that are doing the work, because they've created all the hacks to get around all the process that doesn't actually work. And that's been a really important fundamental piece for us. And I think broadly when we talk about innovation, this idea of being forward-leaning and recognizing the power of data in healthcare and wanting to really lean into that while at the same time making sure that people are conscious of security decisions and privacy decisions. It's a conversation more than anything, right? I think the technical talent is there to be able to make the right choices happen. We just need to continue talking about security and privacy.
So I'm going to tweak the question for you, Jean. So you're not just a cyber expert, but an academic. You're a technologist and an innovator. So what do you wish that other people knew about security, especially as it relates to health?
Sure, yeah. I think that one thing is there's not, I think, a lot of awareness about what technologies already could exist. Sometimes, because I think that there's academic security research, and then there's security practice in industry, and I think there are great practices in industry, but one of the reasons I started the accelerator actually was because I saw this gap where people were, I think that industry has its own set of incentives, and there's a lot of, like we have to put out this fire now, or we have to integrate with legacy systems, but it seems like also there's a lot of ideas from academia that could be transferred, and also conversely, I think academics sometimes are like, well, why don't they just do this way? But it's like, well, there's a lot of, real considerations that need to be taken into account. So I think that more listening on all sides would be helpful, but I think that, what people outside of academia, I guess what I would like to say is there are lots of solutions for the problems that you guys have. And if there were more conversations, there might be better ways to apply those solutions in real world settings. And I think the other reason to talk to academics is sometimes I feel like we don't always understand why something some way. People just say, oh, well, people must just not understand. It's like, well, there are real reasons why things happen certain ways. So I think, talking more on both sides would be really helpful.
Yeah, I just want to add one thing, which is cybersecurity, like this idea of the word cyber, always feels so elusive, right? I remember for the longest time thinking like, I don't know anything about security. And then delving into it and doing threat modeling and like understanding that a lot of the issues that we're facing are not even the most technically complex problems. We just want to throw really technical solutions at them that don't even necessarily solve the problem. And so I think this piece about having real conversations about what the threats are, real conversations about what it is that we are solving for is unbelievably important. Like we need to get out of the buzzwords and have actual conversations about the problems that are happening.
Sonja, do you want to add on to that?
No, I think it goes back to the point of, before when I was talking about, we always attack the what and we never go and look at the why. And I think having those real conversations about why we do things, how things are happening, and again, that's a cultural change that we have to look at and move forward with.
Sadly, we don't have time for questions, but make sure to catch the speaker. Sonja is about to bolt out of here. She has another commitment, but maybe you can, where can people find you? LinkedIn?
I'm on LinkedIn. I'm on LinkedIn.
Find her. All right. Thank you so much for your insight. We appreciate it, and thank you again.
Appreciate it.